Is that a mood ring you're wearing?
Yes, and it's awesome. Do you want to see it?
Where did you get it? I
Okay.
did see it. That's why I'm asking. Where did you get it?
So I got it at Dave and Buster's, but the thing about it is
In like
it's
a claw machine?
no, I won it because I got a lot of tickets.
Oh, well, what is it? What color
But
is
the
it
thing
now?
about it, it's a mood ring for grown-ups.
Oh,
So like if you get black, it's just take off this ring and walk away right now. Do not look back.
huh. What color is it now, though?
Well, right now it's purple, but I think it's wrong because it says that I'm optimistic, excited, and ready for anything.
I think that is a cue for us to start.
33, 1, 0. Main event of the evening. Wednesday and half past the hour.
It's Tuesday, and you're listening to Murder Unscripted.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Murder Unscripted, and I'm your host, Ed Hydock, along with my co host, my partner in true crime, Melissa Spivey.
Hi.
And we are diving into our second block this week. And this is a block that we picked because it involves some incredibly psychopathic people. And we were kind of doing the point was to show you the extreme nature, the other side of murder, the people who
Mhm.
kill for fun. So this one is going to be called Thrill Killers. And we're going to dive into some of the little nuances. And there's so much to discuss. And our featured case is coming in two parts because it's so massive and so personal to me that you are not going to want to miss it. But we have a ton to discuss this week, and I want to jump right into it. So, Melissa, what do you got?
All right, here we go. I decided I wanted to try and kill him for no good reason. Now, that's an actual quote from the 18-year-old murderer that I'm going to be discussing today. So let's back up a little. When Ed and I get together and talk about what we are going to discuss for the next month's block, we go through a lot of different topics. And when we first chose this theme, I honestly had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. Of course, I knew that there were different types of murderers. You know, there's serial killers, mass murderers, spree killers, and our topic of this month's block or theme, hedonistic thrill killers. But I did not realize how many subcategories there are and how much crossover there is between the categories. No serial killer is just one kind. So, this episode is actually going to be really heavy on the psychology of murderers. So, buckle up for that. According to the FBI, there are three top categories of murderers. Those three are serial killers, spree killers, and mass murderers. So, Ed, do you know the difference between those three categories?
Man, what was it? Serial, spree, and mass?
Yes, serial killer, spree killer, mass murderer.
I think so. Doesn't mass murderer, isn't that three or more victims, and
Yes,
spree is multiple victims over like a specific length of time. It doesn't have to be three at once.
right.
Um, and I think a serial killer then would be, I just always took that to mean like multiple victims with a break in between. Like, but I'd be lying if I said that I know how many victims that means or how long in between the killings.
No,
So
that's fair. I mean, you're partially right on all of those answers. So I'm going to try to go over this quickly. But a mass murder is defined as an event in which three or more people are killed. This does not include the killer. So just keep that in mind. The motive for these crimes is often hate, racism, political stuff, or religion. That tends to be like the top ones we see. And these types of murderers are often loners and they might suffer from a mental illness. We see that pretty often. An example of a mass murder would be the Columbine shootings or even the Las Vegas shootings back in 2017.
yep.
Now, for a spree killing, that's when the killer or murderer kills two or more victims over a short amount of time with little to no cooling off period. And these murders can occur in several different locations. So it's not just one place all at once. These murders tend to be very unorganized, and often it's really just murdering whoever is in their way. Have you ever heard of Charles Starkweather?
Charles Starkweather. Wasn't that that was an old. That's an
Yeah,
old
like
case.
1950s.
Yeah, he killed did he kill like a dozen people in a week? And I think he had a teenage girlfriend that he like
Yes,
brought along. What a
he
sicko.
did.
Yeah.
So, long story short, 19-year-old Charles Starkweather was a spree killer. He actually killed 11 people total, but 10 of those murders occurred within 8 days of January 1958.
Wow.
And he did have a 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate.
That's right.
A murderer, that's gross, yeah. A murderer is considered a serial killer when they have murdered 3 or more victims, but all during different times. So they usually only kill one person at a time, and there's generally a cooling off period in between murders. Whereas with the spree killer, there is a very limited cooling off period. So one person I think of with a huge cooling off period is BTK,
Oh, big time. Yeah.
who I said we'd never discuss on the show because I hate him more than anyone in the entire world.
We're gonna have to discuss him because
Absolutely, I'm calling out that day. I
You
hate
can't.
him.
It's just
He makes me so mad.
Who am I gonna talk to then?
Yourself.
Oh, great.
So yeah, he had like a 15-year cooling off period. Like that's insane.
Yeah.
So when you break down those 3, spree killer, serial killer, mass murder, that gets broken down again into 4 types of killers.
God.
You paying attention?
I am.
So we have the visionary, the mission oriented, the power or control oriented, and of course, the hedonistic. So these categories are determined by the behavioral background of the killer, the victim profile, and the manner of death, or what was used, and the location of the crime. So I'm going to very quickly go through the definition of each killer. So for the visionary killer, according to Psychology Today, David Berkowitz is a really good example. He was also known as the Son of Sam. He had visions and he heard voices, and he was driven by inner demons, for lack of a better word. But the FBI puts visionary killers in the disorganized category, which again is more categories to figure out.
Yeah, it's almost like the FBI, FBI, if you're listening, can you make a flow chart on your website of just all the different something that we can follow and reference, please? Is that too much to ask?
You know, I Googled that, like serial
Did you
killer
really?
flow chart. Yes, because I was like, how am I going to figure this out? So I kind of made my own flow chart.
Man.
So my work notebook is filled with work stuff and then like a random serial killer flow chart.
Can you share that with me, please?
Absolutely, I
All right,
will.
great.
So next up is mission-oriented killers. They have a specific reason for killing and they target a specific group. The targeted group could be anything from a specific religious group all the way to specific jobs, such as like sex workers. So this made me think of Robert Hansen. He was the butcher baker of Alaska. He really only killed sex workers.
Absolutely. You know who else? The what do they call Lisk?
Lisk, the Long Island
Long
serial
Island
killer.
serial killer. So so when I was still in production, it was at the tail end, and
Yeah.
people were tossing around the idea of Gilgo Beach. That was what people were like. Have you seen or heard about Gilgo Beach? Like they caught the guy last year. His name's Rex Hewerman.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, and he killed 4 sex workers. Someone allegedly. Someone killed 4 sex workers.
Yes.
And I think there were a bunch of talks about like a feature or a special on the Gilgo Beach slayings. But he falls into that category 100%.
Absolutely. He or she killed a very specific type of victim. So the next category is probably what we're all most familiar with, and that's the power or control oriented killer. And that's when the murderer is obsessed with controlling their quote helpless air quotes victim.
Mm-hmm.
Now this category to me is really all of the major players, I guess. We're talking about John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy. Because if you think about all of their crimes, they all wanted control. I mean, John Wayne Gacy would show his victims a magic trick and put them in handcuffs. You have
Right.
control that way. Jeffrey Dahmer, he tried to drug his victims and like make them pour chemicals into their brain to make them his own sex robots, so zombies of some sort. So he definitely wanted control over these poor victims.
And it's funny because like that one was a chemical induced control, like to make you a zombie, where Gacy
Yeah.
was just trying to manipulate your mind. So like he went a little more passive route and like hoped it would work, hope it
Right.
would lure, you know. So and Dahmer went right for the this is how we're gonna do it. I know this is gonna work.
Yes.
So
And ultimately, they both wanted control.
right.
So this brings us to our last category, which is the hedonistic killer, who is often referred to as the thrill killer, which is a little bit incorrect. So we will get to that.
And that's when you tossed around this idea and you mentioned hedonistic killer, I'm not gonna lie, like I have always heard them called thrill killers. I never knew that the term hedonistic killer was a thing. So I'm very interested in what you have to say.
I had heard it, but I didn't know really what the difference was. So hedonistic killers, these are people who simply kill for the fun of it. They often use phrases like, quote, "I just wanted to see what it felt like," end quote, when referring to murder.
So
Now,
disturbing.
it really is. So this subcategory of murders breaks down again into more categories.
Flowchart.
So we're going from serial, spree, mass murder to the 4 types of murders, and now we're breaking down those 4 types. So we're going to break down hedonistic killers. They're essentially the reasons for the kill. There's a couple reasons, and these subcategories are lust, comfort, or thrill. Lust is about sexual gratification, so we see a lot of killers with that. Comfort has to do with killing for financial gain. And then the thrill killer purely kills for excitement. They kind of need that rush of adrenaline.
Those are the scariest kind to me because it's so unpredictable. Like
There's no rhyme or reason.
none.
So basically, a thrill killer is a subcategory of the hedonistic killer. And because that term covers 3 types, many people use them interchangeably: thrill killer, hedonistic. So I understand the confusion. I was confused. I totally get it. So depending on where you look online, it seems like everyone kind of has a different answer when categorizing all the murders. For example, Ted Bundy, as I stated, I mean, he was obviously a serial killer, so we checked that first one off. But I've also seen him categorized as the power control killer. But he also did that for a little bit of lust and sexual gratification. So then does he fall under the hedonistic killer? And Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, I feel like he was sort of a hedonistic lust killer, but I would also consider him a mission-oriented killer because he targeted sex workers.
Yeah, I agree with that, including that. Well, like you said earlier, they kind of fall into multiple categories.
Yes.
But I would totally agree with that mission-oriented tag, because Ridgway, I mean, he made it his mission, his well-known mission, to kill as many prostitutes as he could. It was like what did he say? He hated them, and he never thought they'd be reported missing. Like we talked about last block. Yeah, when we talked about sex workers being considered less dead than someone white collar or someone, and that was literally the basis for Ridgway's entire mission. So I mean, that mission oriented, I think with him, he falls into that too.
I agree. And what about the Zodiac Killer? Because he's categorized as a hedonistic thrill killer because experts, authorities, everyone agrees that he killed for the thrill or the fun of it.
Yeah, I mean, that one I challenge a little bit, only because we never really found out why the Zodiac committed his crimes. Although it was like,
no one ever caught him.
Right, but it was a letter that he wrote that talked about the fun, just the fun he was having doing it.
Well, and he also in one of his letters talked about, and don't quote me on this because I'm not exactly sure of the quote, but it's something about that killing is more fun than getting your rocks off with a girl.
It's insane.
So
it's insane.
Not kind of sure what fun he's having, but
yeah, for real.
No, I agree, because we don't really know why he committed it, but
right.
All right, Ed, your case this month, or your case for the theme of hedonistic thrill killers, is the Lost Boys of Bucks County. And without giving too much away, can you give us like a brief overview and tell us why you think the subject of your case is in fact a hedonistic thrill killer? Like, tell me why you're putting him in that box, because we just went through all the different boxes.
We did. So I think this one teeters on a couple different boxes, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
we're really going to get into this because I do believe there was a slight mental illness angle involved with it too, but the motive hasn't changed. This When we get into the Lost Boys of Bucks County, it was essentially about four young boys who disappeared over the course of a couple days, and it turns out that they were all linked to one person, and this person, what drove him to kill is so disturbing and so upsetting, and it occupied almost 2 years of my life.
Wow.
And I really want to share with you guys the kind of a deep dark dive into why this kid did what he did. So we'll get into all that.
Well, and I think it's almost fair to say, because you just said he killed a couple of people over 3 days, maybe he falls into the spree killer category.
Right. Right.
So maybe that's something we can look into and kind of research a little bit more for our last episode of this block.
Absolutely.
All right, well, getting into my case for today, it's actually eerily similar to yours. It takes place in a really small town, and the parties involved, meaning the victim and the murderer, they're also very young men. So the case I'm going to be telling you about today and really I would argue that one is a young child, but I'm going to be telling you today about the murder of 13-year-old Stanley Edwards. And this case is a violent murder of a 13-year-old child. So I'm going to give everyone that trigger warning right now. If that's not your thing, I would suggest turning it off and maybe checking in next Tuesday.
Yeah, these are always rough. But Melissa and I both agree that they're so important to tell. So we're in the world I came from. A lot of times networks will create a cutoff. They'll when you're researching a show or pitching case ideas, they'll be like, we don't want to see any cases where the victim is X years old or under. So now that really limits your search, and my assumption is that they think it's too sad, that people aren't going to want to hear this, that it's going to turn viewers off because it's such a heavy topic. But they happen. And I think this is the platform where I want to be able to talk about the stuff that we weren't allowed to talk about on television. So
Right.
they happen, and it's important for people to know they happen. This evil exists in the world, and families have to live with it. Cops have to live with it. And they're awful because it's the epitome of innocence lost. A lot of times these were kids, and they did nothing but trust someone, and this happened to them. And it's sorry, but it's the world we live in.
Well, and I think it's important, and I think the reason it might be extra hard is because everybody was a child. At one point, everybody probably knows a child or has a child in their life. So you can see yourself or your child or whoever in the victim, and that makes it even harder to come to terms with. But you're right, it's important. These things happen. You can't just shut it out because you don't like it.
Yeah, and you can't discriminate against a family who lost a 7-year-old or versus someone who lost an adult loved one. I mean,
right.
It's pure evil, and it's the worst kind of evil, in my opinion, and it deserves to be told.
Well, and what happens like in my case where it's a 18-year-old killing a 13-year-old?
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
Yeah.
So Stanley Edwards was a typical 13-year-old boy in September of 1997. He lived in Waterbury, Connecticut with his mom and his older sister. His father had actually passed away after a long battle with cancer. So, he and his family are recovering from that, and that's not something that you can recover. It's not easily recovered from. It can't be recovered from, whatever you want to say. But Stanley had recently turned 13, less than about 2 months prior to our case, and that was on August 5th, and he was a 7th grader at Westside Middle School. He liked playing with the family dog. The family's dog name was Benny, which I thought was so cute. Stanley liked hanging out with his friends. He liked riding his bike. He was a really cute kid. He had brown hair and brown eyes. He liked to play the guitar, and I saw a picture of his bedroom. He had a Beavis and Butthead poster on the wall, which just made me laugh because that is so a 13-year-old boy in the 90s.
It really is. He was probably quoting it all the time, too, if he were anything like me.
Oh my gosh, I'm having like flashbacks to like middle school of people quoting Beavis and Butthead.
Right.
So On the afternoon of September 30th, 1997, Stanley had been with his friends and told his mom he was going to go on a bike ride. And Stanley was riding his bike in their little town when 18-year-old Todd Rizzo came across him. Stanley came across Todd. And Todd got Stanley's attention. So before we get further into the timeline, let's stop and we're going to talk about Todd for a little bit. So Todd Joseph Rizzo was born on October 11th, 1978 in Virginia. He had an older brother and a younger sister, so he was the middle child. His parents were divorced. I believe they had gotten a divorce when he was about 10 years old. And the kids primarily stayed with their mother. Most sources, if not all the sources that I pulled from, agreed that Todd Rizzo did not have an easy childhood. I didn't read about any horrific physical abuse, but Todd and his siblings were definitely victims of neglect. Sources discuss that he had little to no parental supervision, and when we get to the trial, we will get further into detail about what he went through. Sources also reported that Todd was a bedwetter, and I don't necessarily think it's something to really worry about. However, especially at the time, it was more worrisome because bedwetting is the third of the McDonald triad. Are you familiar with the McDonald triad?
I am. So it's funny because in I've dabbled in fire protection now. It's basically there's a fire triangle where if you it's oxygen, fuel, and heat. And if you take out one of those elements, you can't have a fire. Like a fire can't happen. And it's this guy, he was a psychiatrist, I think, named John McDonald. I think it was John McDonald.
Yeah.
And he wrote an article way back in the 60s, I think, in the American Journal of Psychology about this triangle he came up with, this serial killer triad of behaviors. And
Yes.
I want to say it was bedwetting, cruelty to animals, and and fire, ironically.
Yes.
I think are the three. Is that it? Yeah. So it's
fascination with fire or setting fires.
yeah, and it's probably a similar thing. Like if you take one of those behaviors or elements out of it, maybe they don't manifest. Maybe they're just random behaviors that these people have. But when you put them all together, it's a recipe for disaster.
Right. And you know what? I did a little bit more research because, like you said, this was written back in the 60s. We are now in 2024. So things have changed. And this series is actually from 1963. So we're over 50 years old, if you do that math, which we did not do before we started recording. So now that we're trying to figure it out, let's say 50 plus years.
Yeah, at least.
All right. So things have changed. We still have such a long way to go when it comes to figuring out mental health. But we've made some progress since 1963. So in 2018, researchers kind of partially debunked the McDonald triad, actually. They basically said that these three behaviors were more recognizant of a child with a tough home life rather than a future serial killer. So while these behaviors can be worrisome and definitely need to be dealt with correctly, it doesn't mean if your kid's wetting the bed, we're going to have another Jeffrey Dahmer on our hands. I don't think that's what they're saying here. I think personally the bigger question is nature versus nurture, and I would love to go into that with you one day. Are serial killers born or are they created?
Yeah,
But
I think
that could take us hours.
it really could. I mean, just in short, I think both. I think a little from column A, a little from column B. I personally think that people are wired with certain traits, both good and bad. And if those bad traits are nurtured instead of the good ones, then it's the perfect storm.
I agree. And we're not going to talk about this today, but maybe something we can remember for our last episode of the block. I think head trauma needs to be added to that little triad, but we'll go into that further in another episode. So back to Todd and Stanley. We don't know the particulars of some of Todd's life, but we do know that Todd and his siblings were neglected, like I just said. I did read that their home was filthy and there was cat urine and cat feces all over. And I want to remind everyone, we can feel bad for Todd as the child. That is not a good childhood. No child should have anything but the perfect childhood. However, That does not give you the right to hurt anyone. You don't get to kill someone because you had a shitty time growing up. Like, that's not how it works.
Absolutely not. And I can totally appreciate the fact that a lot of killers had rough upbringings, but there's so many other factors that contribute to their heinous actions later in life. So that cannot be the sole factor.
Absolutely. And we'll get into it with the trial, but I think that they tried to base a lot of his actions as an 18-year-old on what happened to him as a child. So, according to a man named Perrin Margay, who says he was best friends with Todd when they were in middle school, he said that Todd was teased and bullied a lot due to his appearance. He was a tiny kid and he had red hair and freckles, which to me sounds adorable. But you know what? Kids suck. Kids are really mean. They're really mean to each other. They're really mean to others. They're just mean.
Mean is an understatement. Like, I hear it from my kids sometimes. Like, just growing up, it's not as bad now that they're a little older, but when they were going through elementary school, there are some kids like they're just assholes. Like, I'm gonna say it. Like, they just for the sake of it. Some of them are just assholes, just to be mean. Like, they just will do it. And I don't know if it's maybe their home life, the way they were raised, but it's like they're taking out their personal issues on someone else just to make themselves feel better. I guess that's the bully mentality. But they can be really mean for no reason.
They do say hurt people hurt people. But going back to what I just said, you can't blame your childhood.
Right.
Like, you just can't. So, Perrin Markay, Todd's supposed best friend from middle school, he also talks about Todd in high school and said by the time they were in their senior year, Todd really underwent a drastic change. He dyed his hair black, he began watching violent movies, and he became really enthralled with serial killers, which I'm torn on that. I hate when people blame like music and movies for violence. You know, especially depending on when he was watching this. At some point in life, you can't blame the movies. You should know the difference between right and wrong. Also, apparently Todd had serial killer trading cards, which I was not aware were ever a thing. The 90s was wild.
These were a thing. They had garbage pail kid cards. Remember those things?
Those are one thing. Serial killer trading cards are a different thing.
I remember them. I was probably like 12 years old, so that would have been around. I vividly remember them at a certain point in time. I would go down to this local store had them. And it was bizarre because remember, this is before the internet. So you could find them in like weird trade shows and flea markets and stuff. And they were even then I thought they were tasteless. And since you were talking about these, I did a little research and you can find them. They were released by a company called Eclipse Enterprises. Great business decision, Eclipse, by the way.
Good job, guys.
Yeah.
Good work.
But you can still find them on eBay. They were super rare, and they're so like, why are you promoting this?
That's one of those products. You and I were talking about something the other day, and we're like, multiple people had to sign off on this.
Yes, there was a meeting that were like, let's do it.
Good idea.
Great idea, Bob.
Well, Todd had these serial killer trading cards, and many articles brought up the fact that he was obsessed with Jeffrey Dahmer, which in 1997, Jeffrey Dahmer had only been caught, 6 years earlier, I think in the summer of 91. And I feel like that horror was pretty fresh still, I would say. And he had been dead for a few years. I think he was killed in 94, but still, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. So, but on the flip side, if anyone searched my computer history, I'd be in trouble. So I can't say that looking like you're obsessed with a serial killer.
If you ever die, my job, when you die, I'm going to just, before your body's even found, I'm going to take your computer and your phone and just
wipe it.
They're going to vanish.
I love you for that. That's what best friends are for.
You're welcome. I got you.
I got you too.
Good.
So in 1996, Todd Rizzo joined the Marines, and he was supposed to be enlisted for 4 years. He lasted about 10 months before he was other than honorably discharged. And that was because he tested positive for marijuana.
Lame.
And according to Lance Corporal John Fleischer, who testified in Todd's trial, Todd decided he wasn't cut out for the military after other Marines heckled him for passing out after a 9-mile march. Which there has to have been more to it than that.
Right. That's ridiculous.
So listen to how he did this. Instead of just smoking the weed and getting caught, he straight up swallowed a handful, which I don't know how much that is. All the sources just said a quote handful of marijuana. And then he just chased it with water. Like, would you even get high from that? Just eating weed? And
I don't know.
I don't know. No, I really don't. But gross. That sounds disgusting.
Doesn't sound gross.
So Todd was drug tested. He tested positive and he was sent home. And it was only 2 weeks after he got home, after he was discharged from the Marines, that like our story takes place.
Wow.
Yeah. So back to
Man.
the night of September 30th, 1997. And I actually looked up the weather report from that day. Because I just wanted to see like what it was. Like, this is
Sure.
September, school has started, but I don't think the clocks had been set back yet. So it's still light out. It's still nice. The weather's probably still nice. And actually, that night in Waterbury, Connecticut, it was 62 degrees out. So,
Pleasant.
sweatshirt, jeans, riding your bike, that sounds great.
That sounds great.
So on that day, Todd had finished his day of work at Errett Sales, which was in Cheshire, Connecticut, which was about 15 to 20 minutes from his home in the Bunker Hill section of Waterbury, Connecticut. Errett Sales was like a lawn and garden wholesale company. And as of today, it looks like they're still around, but in a different city. I think it's the same company. So Todd left his job at Errett Sales around 5 p.m. and he heads home where, like I said, he lived with his mother, his older brother, and his younger sister. So at some point later that evening, about 6:30 p.m., Stanley Edwards, 13-year-old Stanley Edwards, tells his mom that he's going to go ride his bike and he'll be back. And he doesn't tell her where he was going. This is a small town. It was safe. It's still light out. But I don't think he had any plans to go far on his bike. It was just really to ride around town, see what's going on, kill some time before, probably bedtime or homework and bedtime. So we don't know where Stanley went for the next hour to 75 minutes. Maybe rode around, went to friends, but we do know that about 7:45 that night, his bike led him down Marion Avenue, and that was the street that Todd Rizzo lived on. Now, Stanley saw Todd outside, and he stopped his bike to talk to him. And before we get into like stranger danger, let's remember, Todd is an 18-year-old kid. He doesn't look like John Wayne Gacy. He isn't creepy looking. Like the things you would think of when you hear stranger danger. You think of like a creepy man in a trench coat. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
He was 18, and from looking at pictures of him, he looks even younger. So he's not coming across as someone scary. And not only that, but Stanley was kind of familiar with Todd because prior to the job at Errett Sales, Todd worked at a local video rental place.
Oh, wow.
I know, which I'm like, whoa, flashbacks to anyone who was not alive when Blockbuster was popular. A video rental place was exactly what it sounds like. You could rent videos, VHSs, you could rent video games.
And if you went to rent
DVDs.
a popular movie, there's a good chance it wasn't there. Like you had to wait until someone returned it. They always had to check the rewind pile, like that return pile. There was just a bin. It was like digging through, be like, here's one, Jurassic Park. All right.
One time I didn't rewind it, and the lady behind the counter got so mad at me, and so did my mom. So
that's a federal offense, actually.
I'm still scarred. So Stanley knew Todd because he had gone to this video rental store probably every Friday. That's what we did when we were growing up.
Right.
So Todd wasn't a random stranger. Like, he knew him. So Todd strikes up a conversation with Stanley, and during this talk, he at some point works in a conversation and asks, does your mom know where you are tonight? Does anyone, know what you're doing? Which to me sounds weird, but that's because we're adults and we're doing a true crime podcast, so anything sounds weird. But to 13-year-old Stanley, that wasn't weird. He's like, no, I just told my mom I was heading out. So according to court records, it was at this time that Todd Rizzo decided he was going to kill 13-year-old Stanley Edwards. So let that sink in for a second. An 18-year-old kid has just made the decision to kill a 13-year-old.
It's absolutely sickening to me. And I think this story hits me a little harder because I have a 16-year-old son, and my stepson is 11. And so that's the same age difference as these two people we're talking about. And the way my stepson looks up to my son, he trusts him, he listens to him. I have to tell my son to like reel it in because he's talking about 16-year-old stuff. And I got to like bring it down. Like when you're around him, you can't. The other day he like convinced him to try ghost pepper sauce, and it ended in tears and yelling and accusing. And regardless, it's a trust thing. It's like a role model thing. Like you are taught to trust people. You're not going to inherently be what's the word, like skeptical, I guess, like
Right.
especially if it's around your age. Like you see these older kids, you look up to them. So
Oh my God, they're so cool.
exactly. So to take advantage of that trust and that innocence is absolutely disgusting.
It is. It's sick. So this next part is going to be rough. Trigger warning for the murder of a child. I'm not going to go into unnecessary detail, but even without the detail, it is pretty graphic. So Todd tells Stanley that there were snakes in his backyard, and he's like, "You want to go see them?" And of course, Stanley, the 13-year-old's like, "Heck yeah, I do." So Todd's like, "All right, let's go to my backyard, but first I gotta find a flashlight." So he and Stanley go to Todd's car to get this flashlight, and again, this is sometime between 7:45 and 8 p.m. So I'm not sure where Todd's family was at this point. I'm guessing they weren't home. It wasn't in any sources. So
Can you even fathom how excited Stanley would have been for an older kid to be like, grab a flashlight, we're gonna go looking for snakes?
we're gonna go hang out.
He must have been so excited to be led to his death and not even know it. Like it's so disgusting.
I would have gone if a cool older girl would have asked me to do something at that age. I would have been there in a heartbeat.
In a heartbeat.
Absolutely. There's no questions asked. I would have been like, yes, like this is so cool. So they get to the backyard and Todd gets the flashlight. And as Stanley turns around to head to the backyard, Todd silently grabs a 10-inch long 3-pound sledgehammer and he hides it in the waistband of his pants. So once they get into the backyard, he hands Stanley the flashlight. And when Stanley looks away, Todd raises the sledgehammer above his head and just swings it down, hitting Stanley in the side of the head. Stanley falls to the ground and he begs Todd to stop. And this next part is from Todd's confession to the police, and again, trigger warning. After Stanley fell, Todd said, quote, "I sat on him like a horse and hit him a bunch of times in the head because I didn't want him to scream sorry."
This is awful.
Why'd you have to bring up Jake and Joshua? It's fine.
This is awful.
Okay. Todd said, quote, "I sat on him like a horse and hit him a bunch of times in the head because I didn't want him to scream out and alert the neighbors." End quote. He goes on to say, quote, "I can't remember how many times I hit him, but he made a gurgling sound again. So I hit him at least 1 or 2 more times." End quote.
This is why this stuff is so important for people to hear. Like
I
this
agree.
this is the world we live in.
Ed and I are having a tough time getting through this part. Todd Rizzo eventually told police, quote, "After I found out that no one knew where he was, I decided I want to try and kill him for no good reason and get away with it." So it was later determined that Todd had hit Stanley at least 12 or 13 times. And I say both because I saw both numbers reported. But 4 of those hits were directly to his head. And it wasn't determined which of those hits was fatal because all of them could have been. But there was evidence, and this is really gut-wrenching, that there was evidence that Stanley had tried to protect himself. So during the vicious murder, Todd's neighbor actually came outside at one point because his dogs were freaking out. So he went to see what was going on.
Sure.
But Todd said he stayed completely still and hid the beam of the flashlight. And the neighbor just went back inside, like
Wow.
having no clue that just feet away was the badly beaten body of a 13-year-old Stanley Edwards.
Awful.
So Todd knows now that he needs to hide Stanley's body and also get rid of Stanley's bike because they're both at his house. So I don't know what kind of car Todd drove, but he soon realizes that he can't fit Stanley and the bike in his car at the same time. So he first takes the bike and he disposes of it. When Todd returns back to his house, he wraps Stanley's body in trash bags and he puts them in the trunk of his car. By 8:30 p.m., and this is literally 45 minutes after Stanley stopped his bike at Todd's house. So 45 minutes after, Todd has found a dark parking lot on a housing, like in a housing complex, to leave Stanley's poor little body. This 18-year-old, so that's just let this sink in for a second. This 18-year-old kid ruined his life, ended the life of a 13-year-old, and altered forever so many other lives in a mere 45 minutes. I couldn't even get through one of your shows in that time.
Right. Right.
Like, when you think
An
about it
episode of
that way,
television. A television
episode
show.
of television. This was
Freaking
all
awful.
done. Like,
So this
that part fucked me up.
And absolutely. And this kid is 18 and doing this. Like
18.
so his brain isn't even fully developed. Like the panic that must have been going through, like I know he was doing this for fun, but
Right.
he then had to go into planning mode. And I've seen a 16-year-old plan and it's not great. So
Right.
I can't even imagine how much he was like putting the pieces together in his head of what I did and how do I cover it up.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't even imagine what was going on in his brain. And Stanley's body ended up being discovered that night at 8:45.
Wow.
He had been dead for less than an hour. It was 1 hour before that he got to Todd's house and said, "Hey, like, how are you?"
Wow.
So the investigation went pretty quickly. This wasn't really too much of a whodunit. Less than 24 hours, actually, they had determined that Todd was the number one suspect. A witness had seen Todd's car in the area where Stanley's body was found. So Todd was taken to the police station just to talk. You know, they were interviewing all the neighbors and anybody around. And the whole time, he acted like he had absolutely no idea who Stanley was. He's like,
course.
"Nope, I don't know anything
Yeah.
about him. I don't even know who he is."
Deny, deny, deny.
Right. And police are like, their spidey senses were tingling and they weren't buying his lies. So before they take him home, they ask if they can search his car. And Todd's like, "Sure," because I'm sure, just like every other criminal, he thinks he can outsmart the police. So pretty quickly, they find blood in the trunk. And Todd thought he was so smart by, taking the car mats out of his car and wrapping the body in trash bags. Well, this blood was actually found, like, in where the spare tire goes in a trunk.
Oh, like underneath the, I know what
in
you're
the
saying.
wheel well. Like, I don't
Yep.
know what exactly it's called, but
It's not a wheel well. It's like it's just a dip, like a cavity in your trunk.
yes.
Yeah.
So that's where they ended up finding the blood. So the police show the blood smears to Todd, and according to court records, he begins to make statements such as, "I feel sick and I did it."
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Feel real sick.
So Todd was arrested for the murder of Stanley Edwards, and over the next few days, Todd just keeps on talking. He doesn't shut his mouth, and this is when he spills to detectives his admiration of Jeffrey Dahmer and all the other serial killers that he idolizes. Like Bailey Sarian says, people get better idols.
Right.
So he tells detectives that when he started talking to Stanley on that fateful night, he just suddenly, quote, "had an urge."
So it's almost like
Really?
this wasn't even pre-planned. It was just something he's always wanted to do and found the right
Mhm.
opportunity. Like how messed up.
Just wait. He has a list of all the things he wants to do. Just wait.
Sure.
So he's arrested. He's put in jail while he's awaiting trial. Now, this part, in January 1999, Todd Rizzo has the audacity to write a public letter to Stanley's mom, Jean, asking for her forgiveness.
Right.
So,
You've seen it time and time again. It's like it's the everything after the fact. Now
After the
we're
fact.
sad. Now we want to be. Now we're changed. This wasn't me.
but you know what's even sicker? Like, he's ballsy enough for writing this letter, but to make it public, I hate that. It feels
He's a kid.
disgusting. It feels like a publicity stunt.
Right. That's
He
what it
wants
is.
sympathy and attention.
That's exactly what it is.
And I urge everyone to read the letter. It's ridiculous. I will see if we can post a link or a picture of the letter. It was
Hmm.
published in the Hartford Courant. And I don't have the quotes of what his mother said, but I mean, Stanley's mom is basically like, "Are you kidding me?" She at one point even says, "I don't even get that newspaper."
Yeah,
Like,
good for her. Good for
just
her.
so ridiculous. All right, Ed, you're a parent. I
I am
hate
a
to make you
parent.
think about this. What would you do if someone hurt your child and then writes you this letter? I can tell you that as a dog mom, if someone looks at my dogs wrong, I mean, I'm never going to forgive them. I would end up in jail myself if someone hurt Lucy or Milo. 100%.
I unfortunately the nature of my profession kind of made me think about it. Like
Yeah.
you're too exposed to it to not think about it. And my whole outlook on everything changed. Like when I was young, I was in this business before I had kids, and that was you could you could look at crime scene photos with breakfast. I mean, it's no big deal. But
Right.
then when you have kids, these kid cases, they change you and you start to look at everything differently, and especially cases like this. And I'm sitting here bawling because like that's what it does to you. And I've spoken to victims family members who that's their way of healing. That's how they move on. They forgive. But I have always wondered in the back of my head if they truly forgive or if that's just what they're telling themselves. And they're better people than I am because I'm not wired that way.
I
And
know, me neither.
I think I agree. I would be in jail myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so on Friday, August 13th, so this is Friday the 13th of
Hmm.
1999, Todd Rizzo was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection for the September 1997 murder of 13-year-old Stanley Edwards.
Good.
According to the Hartford Courant, Todd Rizzo read a statement to the court that in part said, quote, "Stanley never deserved what happened to him. He was a good kid, and I'm sorry that I took him away from the Edwards family. I wish I could bring him back. He should be at home with his mother right now." End
Just
quote.
shut it. Like,
Right?
just shut it.
Well, Stanley's poor mother, she just reacted in the most relatable way. She screamed at Todd in court, calling him a son of a bitch, and she just like dissolved into sobs. And this shitbag, Todd Rizzo, didn't even react. He just kept reading his statement.
Of course he did. He knew what he did. Now this was damage control at this point. It didn't
Mm-hmm.
one of these like it didn't dawn on him till after the fact that that his actions would have repercussions. And it's like no matter what he said was just lip service at that point to make himself look better in the eyes of the public and that family.
Yes, I agree. And I mean, his poor mother. I mean, she lost her husband. Remember, he died of
Yep.
cancer. Stanley's mom. She loses a child in such a horrific and violent way, and then to be put through trial. I think that would be the worst part. It's like your mind can already create terrible situations, but then when you hear it all and you put yourself in that space, and as a parent, I'm sure that there's no way possible that you cannot put yourself in that headspace. And all of these despicable and horrible things are taken out on her baby, and like she has to sit there. So Stanley's mom later told the papers that she didn't expect to have that outburst, but she said she felt like she was reliving like everything all over again.
But that's what these trials do. So we've talked
Yeah.
about this before. Like when this crime happens, it takes so long to absorb what actually happened and learn to live without that person. To know they died in such a horrific way is a whole nother layer. You're not just dealing with death. Like imagine someone you love has a heart attack and passes away. It's sad. It's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
But I can only imagine that this level of violence tacked on to that makes it worse. And it's just when the trial comes up, exhibits come out, pictures you may have never seen come up. Every little detail about that person's life, about the perpetrator's life, about the victim's life, um, details about how one person did things to another person come out. And it may be things that you're not prepared to handle. So trials have a way of bringing all of these emotions back. And that's why some families will take a plea bargain. They don't want to go
Yeah.
through it. You know, that's kind of the foundation of a plea bargain. They just want it done with.
And I think before I really got into true crime, I didn't understand why they would take a plea bargain. Like, why wouldn't you want this person to suffer to the full extent of the justice system? But I 100% get it. I mean, I don't 100% get it. I don't want to ever get it, but I understand why they would pick the plea bargain. I think I would too.
There's also a chance they get off. Like, you don't run the risk of, if you go to trial, you never know. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be a rock solid case, but you just never know. So a plea bargain's like a sure thing.
Right. Well, we're gonna go ahead a couple years. So in 2003, Todd's death sentence was actually reversed, but it was reinstated in 2005. Now this next part, it's not gonna make you sad as much as it's gonna make you angry. In
Great.
2010, yeah, right. In 2010, Rizzo's attorneys appealed the death penalty. And I'm not laughing. This is just so asinine. His lawyers argued that the death sentence, Ed, was cruel and unusual punishment. To which
Get
I
the
say, fuck right off.
For real. Like, you know what was
Fuck
cruel
right
and
off with
unusual?
that.
Everything
Using
you
a
did.
sledgehammer to murder a 13-year-old boy. That's
This
what
shit
I would consider
never
cruel and unusual.
ceases to amaze me. None of this. It's just you think you've heard it all, and it's still, to hear specific instances like this are just like, blows your mind.
Absolutely ridiculous. Cruel and unusual after what he did.
Yeah.
Rizzo also whined that he had a troubled childhood, and that
Aw.
wasn't taken into account. And you know what? Again, lots of people have less than perfect childhoods.
Yeah.
You don't get to kill someone.
It does not give
that's not
you
how it works.
It is not a get out of jail free card.
So I actually did read the court records. I fell down a rabbit hole and started reading court records from the appeal. And Todd's family did get up and testify about his childhood, and it was shitty. I'm making that 100% clear. I'm not arguing it. However, it's not an excuse. So Todd's parents fought a lot, and they did eventually divorce, like I said, when Todd was 10. And it kind of seemed like that was the final crack in his mother's already fragile mental state. She fell into a deep depression, which is what led to the neglect and what eventually led to their house falling in disrepair. Neighbors and family friends testified that Todd would spend hours watching gory horror movies, and his mother never stopped him. I feel like the court records put his mom's parenting skills, or lack thereof, on trial, which I think is something we're going to talk about in your case, which I think we have a lot to say about the murderer and his family.
Yeah.
And I think the court almost made it seem more like, whose fault is this?
That's
Clearly,
because that's
go ahead.
Yeah, they're grasping at straws. They're trying, that's all they're doing at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, he made the decision to brutally murder a 13-year-old.
Right,
And
you
I'm a
know
firm
right
believer.
from wrong.
Exactly, you know right from wrong. And I'm a firm believer in personal accountability. Like, if you screw up, say you screwed up.
Right.
But I almost feel like his parents are a little bit accountable here. I understand his mother's plight. Mental health is no joke. And you know what? If we're going to get real and unscripted, as someone who also struggles with mental health, it can be debilitating. I get that.
Right.
But you don't get to stop being a parent.
Right.
It doesn't work. I mean, again, it just doesn't work like that.
Right.
I do wonder about how his mom feels about everything, like during the trial and now. I looked, but I couldn't find any further information other than her name, which I'm not going to share, but you can Google it.
She's if I had to guess, I would say she's beating herself up. It's now, I'll bet you she has fallen into some deep depression herself. And this is all speculation. I have no idea about anything. Don't quote me on anything, but that's just what I would guess, because there's probably a guilt that exists for her lack of shitty parenting years ago has now created a horror story for another family to live.
Right. Well, at the end of the day, ultimately, the testimonies of Todd's, tumultuous childhood and life really didn't make a difference. That appeal was denied the following year. In 2018, however, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison, which I'm okay with. He's locked away. He's hopefully not going to hurt anyone else. I'm almost done. This was a really crappy one to get through, but I did want to mention this part, and I wasn't really sure where to put it. But at some point, and I mentioned his list, his goal list earlier, at some point when Todd was in the Marines, he and his fellow servicemen were either instructed to or encouraged to create a list of their goals,
Hmm.
which, you would think would be positive.
Right.
Would you like to know what Rizzo's top goals were?
Not particularly. Like, I stopped giving a shit about this guy like 45 minutes ago, but I'm interested.
Well, the answer should be no. So you chose correctly, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Goal number 1 was to, quote, marry a black woman,
Oh,
which I don't,
good, solid goal.
right? I don't understand. Goal number 2, how about marry someone you love? But anyway,
Exactly. No, whatever. That we're not. Yes.
goal number 2 was to, quote, kill another man, end quote.
Well, this guy, man, great goals.
And mind you, we know about this list because his friend who testified, the cripple Flesher guy, told the court about it and said, quote, I found his goals kind of off at the time, but I didn't think, God, let me go tell somebody about this. I didn't think he'd carry it out, end quote.
It's another. If he would have said something, who knows? But again, you said this happened like 2 weeks after he was discharged. So,
well, and how many times have you probably, I mean, I would never make a list, but if someone forgets to do something, you're like, oh, I could kill him. But that's
it's
so different than writing it down.
It's
I
a
feel
turn
like.
of phrase. Yeah.
Right. So to kind of finish out this case, I read an opinion piece in the Day newspaper out of New London, Connecticut, and the writer, Lee Elsey, wrote a piece entitled, quote, again, protecting killers, forgetting their cruelty, end quote. And it was about how murderers are taken care of by the United States and taxpayers, and they get to continue living their life even after their despicable deeds. And the article actually did mention Todd, Rizzo, and Stanley Edwards. And the author wrote something that really got in my head, and I wanted to share it with you. So, Lee Elsey wrote, quote, murder victims don't get another Christmas or birthday party. They don't get to see another Super Bowl, sunrise, or rainstorm. Murder victims don't get a hug from their mom, or a kiss from their spouse, or one last face lick from the new puppy. They are dead and gone forever, end quote. And this quote clearly fucked me up because I thought of Stanley.
The things when I used to sit across from victims' families, and we're just talking about it, But when you hear the person relive it, and when you hear them tell you about the things they were robbed of, graduation, prom, first love, their wedding, the things that Stanley will never get to experience, things his family and friends will never get to experience with him.
Right.
And I can tell you with 1,000,000% certainty that not a day goes by where Stanley's parents don't think about him. And it's the whole reason that I thought it was so important to continue working in true crime. This is why.
In conclusion of this terribly sad, horrible case, I think it's really important to remind everyone, go hug your loved ones, make every day with them special. And you know what, on that note, I just want to say, Ed, you're my bestie. I love you. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. We appreciate you so much.
Yeah, I love you too. I love you much less for dragging me down that.
Fair.
Man. Well, we have some great stuff in store next week. I'm going to tell you a very personal story. Like I mentioned earlier, one that took up years of my life, and I made some great connections and some great friends out of it. But it is one of the saddest stories. Sad in a not. This is different.
Yeah.
But this one was tragic and affected a lot of people in my community. So it's a story that really hits home. So I want to share it with you guys next week over the 2 weeks. It's a two-parter. So we're going to get into all that and more.
All right. Well, everyone, stay safe and always remember, perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
It's a fact.
Bye.
What does your mood ring say now?
It just exploded off my finger. In pieces everywhere. Kind of like my heart right now. Thanks for listening to another episode of Murder Unscripted. If you like us, and we hope that you do, don't forget to like and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Check us out on Facebook, TikTok, Insta at Murder Unscripted. Shoot us an email, murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com, or shout out on our website, www.murderunscriptedpod.com.